In 2005, Emily Brown won a $4.2 million lottery. Less than 60 days later, she vanished into thin air, leaving her car running on the side of a Denver highway. 9 years later, the world had moved on, but a leak in an old attic was about to reveal a secret that would stop the city of Denver in its tracks. Emily's mother found a hidden journal and a camera containing photos of the man who hunted her daughter. But the real horror wasn't just the kidnapping. It was the reason why Emily, despite being free, refused to come home for nearly a decade. Today, we unseal the files on the lottery winner, who was betrayed by her own blood. You are watching Cold Case Archives. Highway. I-25 was quiet that night, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. Headlights from passing cars flashed briefly across a forest green sedan, parked awkwardly on the shoulder. Its driver's door hung open. The engine was cold. No signs of a crash, no visible struggle, just silence, and a life that had suddenly stopped. Inside the car sat $400 in cash, untouched, her purse still there, her keys still inside the ignition. But Emily Brown, gone. No ransom call, no goodbye message, no body, no answers. And here's the question that still burns nearly 2 decades later. If money wasn't taken, why was she? Pause for a second and think about that. Have you ever left somewhere feeling watched? Have you ever sensed danger but couldn't prove it? Have you ever told yourself you were overreacting, only to regret ignoring your instincts? Because Emily felt it. Friends later said she had grown tense after winning the lottery. She stopped answering unknown numbers. She checked her mirrors more often. She stopped sleeping with her curtains open. People laughed it off. They said wealth makes people paranoid. They said she should enjoy her luck. But someone was watching her. Someone close enough to know her routines. Someone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. And that moment came on October 14th, 2005. When police arrived at that abandoned car, officers expected to find a stranded driver. Not the beginning of a nightmare that would steal 9 years from a mother and daughter. Right here is where most viewers look away. Right here is where people think, this could never happen to me. But it does. To ordinary people, on ordinary nights, on roads you drive every day. If stories like this make you uncomfortable, that's the point. Awareness keeps people alive. Subscribe now. Missing signs early could save someone you love. Still refusing to subscribe? Tell us why in the comments. Let's talk about it. Because tonight's story is not only about a disappearance, it's about betrayal from the people you trust most. It's about lies strong enough to destroy a family. And it's about a discovery made 9 years later, hidden inside a dusty attic, that exposed everything. What you're about to hear is painful. It will make you angry. It will make you question who you trust. And by the end, you'll understand why one simple object changed the entire case. But before Emily vanished, she was just a daughter driving home from her mother's birthday, holding secrets she planned to reveal that very night. And she never made it back. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Before headlines turned her into a case file, Emily Brown was simply someone people leaned on when life felt heavy. She worked long shifts as a dental hygienist, steady hands, gentle voice, the kind of presence that calmed nervous patients. Co-workers said she remembered everyone's stories, a single mother juggling 2 jobs, a teenager terrified of braces, an elderly man who came in just to talk because he felt alone. Yet Emily listened to them all. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't chasing fame. She drove an older sedan that rattled during winter mornings and carried a travel mug stained from too much coffee. Her biggest worry used to be whether she'd have time to visit her mother after work or squeeze in grocery shopping before the store closed. Her world was small, and she liked it that way. Every Sunday, she visited Lucille. They cooked together, argued about silly things, laughed too loudly, and ended the night watching old movies they had seen 100 times before. Friends joked that Emily never truly grew up because she still called her mother whenever something good or bad happened. And she was proud of that closeness. But everything shifted the day she bought a lottery ticket without thinking twice. A casual purchase during a lunch break. No grand dreams attached to it. No big plan for sudden wealth. When the numbers matched, she didn't scream. She froze. $4.2 million. People think money solves problems. For Emily, it created a wall between who she used to be and who others suddenly expected her to become. Calls started coming in from distant relatives she barely knew. Old classmates reached out with business proposals. People who had ignored her for years began asking for small favors. Her quiet routine disappeared overnight. Coworkers noticed she started locking her office drawer, something she had never done before. She stopped staying late. She began checking the parking lot before leaving work. One friend recalled Emily whispering, "I don't know who actually cares about me anymore, and who only sees the money." That fear grew heavier each week. Even simple errands felt different. People stared longer. Conversations felt forced. Compliments felt hollow. She began sleeping with a lamp on because darkness made her feel exposed. Still, she tried to hold on to normal life. She kept working. She kept visiting Lucille. She kept smiling for people who expected her to feel lucky. But inside, pressure was building. A quiet dread she struggled to explain. And just days before she vanished, Emily started writing things down. Private thoughts, observations, worries she didn't want to say out loud yet. Words that would later reveal how close danger had moved into her world. By October 14th, 2005, Emily wasn't just nervous anymore. She was exhausted from carrying fear alone. That night was supposed to be simple. Lucille's 50th birthday, a small family dinner, laughter, cake, and familiar faces. But from the moment Emily walked through the restaurant door, something felt off. Witnesses later said she didn't sit with her back to the room. She chose a chair facing the entrance. Her purse never left her lap. Her eyes moved constantly, checking who walked in, who left, who lingered too long near the tables. At first, relatives joked that sudden wealth had made her anxious. Someone teased that she needed a vacation. Someone else said she should hire security if she was that worried. Emily forced a smile, but it never reached her eyes. Halfway through dinner, her phone lit up with a call she refused to answer. She silenced it quickly and turned the screen down. Minutes later, another message appeared. Her hands shook slightly as she read it. Lucille noticed. She leaned closer and asked what was wrong. Emily hesitated. She looked around the table, at people laughing, passing plates, sharing stories. For a brief second, it seemed like she wanted to say something important, something urgent, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "I'll tell you later, when it's just us." Those words would haunt Lucille forever. As the night went on, Emily's attention drifted toward the windows. A dark vehicle parked across the street caught her eye more than once. When someone got up to leave, she watched them until they disappeared from view. At 11:15 p.m., she hugged her mother tightly, longer than usual, stronger than usual. "Drive safe," Lucille told her. Emily nodded, but she didn't look reassured. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. She walked quickly to her car, locking the doors immediately after getting inside. Her surveillance cameras captured her leaving the parking lot, headlights cutting across empty streets as she began the 20-minute drive home. She never made it. Somewhere along at 25, something stopped her journey. Something forced that car onto the shoulder. Something made her leave everything behind. Cash, keys, purse, without a trace. And for 9 years, no one knew the truth she planned to reveal that night. The moment Emily's lottery win became public, her life stopped belonging to her. The phone calls started before sunrise the next morning, numbers she didn't recognize, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some sounded happy for her, at least at first, but the conversations changed quickly. "What are you planning to do with all that money? You should invest with me. I've got an idea that could double your winnings." At work, patients asked personal questions instead of talking about their appointments. Strangers suddenly knew where she lived. Cashiers congratulated her like they were close friends. Every interaction carried a hidden expectation. Emily tried to stay grounded. She kept her job. She avoided expensive purchases. She told herself she didn't want to become someone unrecognizable. But the pressure didn't slow down. Relatives she barely knew appeared with emotional stories about unpaid bills. Former classmates reached out with detailed business proposals. One distant acquaintance even showed up at her workplace without warning, insisting they had a life-changing opportunity she couldn't ignore. But her daily routine started to collapse under the weight of attention. She stopped answering unknown numbers. She changed her grocery schedule. She began scanning parking lots before leaving buildings. Friends noticed her laughter fading. She started leaving gatherings early. She grew uncomfortable discussing money because every conversation seemed to lead back to what she owed someone else. And slowly, gratitude turned into anxiety. Emily confided in one coworker that she felt like people were watching her choices, judging how she spent money, who she trusted, and whether she deserved the life she suddenly had. The hardest part wasn't the attention from strangers. It was the shift in how familiar faces began to treat her. Conversations that used to be casual started sounding like negotiations, and friendly check-ins became financial discussions. Invitations came with expectations attached. For the first time in her life, Emily began questioning the intentions of people she had known for years. And she had no idea that the most dangerous pressure wasn't coming from strangers at all, but from someone already inside her circle. If strangers made Emily uncomfortable, family pressure hurt far more. Mike had always been the loud cousin, the one who dominated conversations and promised big ideas that rarely worked out. Growing up, people excused his behavior as confidence, but behind the jokes and charm, his financial life had been collapsing for years. By the time Emily won the lottery, Mike's debts weren't rumors anymore. They were threats knocking on his door. He owed money to people who didn't wait patiently. As phone calls turned into confrontations, friendly reminders became aggressive demands. And when Emily suddenly became wealthy, Mike saw an escape route. At first, he framed his requests as opportunities. He spoke about opening a restaurant together. He mentioned real estate deals he claimed were guaranteed to succeed. He said families should support each other when life presented a chance like this. Emily listened politely, but she hesitated to commit. That hesitation changed his tone. Texts started arriving late at night, asking why she didn't trust him. Calls came back to back when she didn't respond immediately. He began dropping by her home without warning, bringing paperwork she never agreed to review. Friends recalled Emily saying Mike's voice sounded different whenever money came up, sharper, louder, less patient. One afternoon, during a family gathering, their disagreement spilled into the open. Witnesses described Mike raising his voice while accusing her of abandoning family values. Emily stood firm, telling him she wouldn't fund projects she didn't believe in. The room fell silent. What disturbed people most wasn't the argument itself. It was the look Mike gave her before leaving, a long, cold stare that lingered even after the conversation ended. After that day, Emily's anxiety intensified. She stopped sharing details about her schedule with relatives. She avoided answering Mike's calls unless she felt emotionally prepared for another confrontation. In her private notes, she described feeling pressured, not by strangers seeking fame, but by someone who knew her weaknesses and personal history. And while Mike's desperation grew louder, another figure was moving quietly into her life. Someone who didn't shout or argue, but slowly gained control over her finances and daily decisions. While Mike's pressure came through loud arguments, Dave moved quietly. He stepped into Emily's life as the helpful expert, a trusted family friend who claimed he wanted to protect her from financial mistakes. At first, his advice seemed reasonable: organize her accounts, manage taxes, build a trust to secure her future. But his visits became more frequent. He showed up with folders filled with complex paperwork she struggled to understand. He spoke quickly, pushing her to sign documents before she had time to ask questions. When she hesitated, he reminded her how quickly wealth could disappear if she didn't act immediately. If Emily started feeling trapped inside conversations she couldn't control, he appeared at her home without warning. He reviewed her spending decisions without being asked. He positioned himself as the gatekeeper between her and her own money, and just as Dave tightened his grip, another familiar face kept appearing in the background: Kaylin. Their relationship had ended months earlier, but he refused to fully disappear. Neighbors noticed his car parked near her street at odd hours. A coworker said Emily spotted him standing across from her workplace one afternoon, pretending to check his phone while watching the entrance. Whether he wanted reconciliation or simply refused to let go, his constant presence added another layer of fear. 3 men, 3 different pressures, all moving closer into her life at the same time. And for the first time, Emily began to feel surrounded. Right here is where many warning signs get ignored: pressure from family, control from trusted advisors, familiar faces refusing boundaries. Subscribe now so you recognize danger before it reaches this stage. Not subscribing? Tell us why in the comments. Your honesty helps this community grow stronger. After weeks of mounting tension, Emily began writing short notes about conversations and encounters she couldn't shake from her mind. She documented unexpected visits, uncomfortable requests, and the growing sense that her world was closing in around her. Those private words would later reveal just how serious her fears had become. By early October, Emily's fears stopped feeling abstract. She began noticing the same dark SUV in places that made no sense. At first, she brushed it off. A coincidence, maybe a neighbor with a similar routine. But the vehicle appeared too often to ignore. It sat across from her workplace parking lot on multiple mornings. It lingered near the grocery store she visited every Wednesday evening. It rolled slowly past her home late at night, headlights cutting through her street before disappearing again. Emily tried to convince herself she was overreacting. Sudden wealth had already changed how people looked at her. Maybe it was also changing how she saw the world. But one evening, she remained inside her car for nearly 10 minutes, watching that SUV through her rearview mirror before stepping out. She later told a coworker she felt watched even when she couldn't see anyone clearly inside. That was when she began documenting everything. It's short notes written late at night, quick reminders about conversations that left her shaken. Mentions of unexpected visits, strange phone calls, and the growing sense that someone knew her routine better than she did. Her entries became more urgent as days passed. She wrote about feeling surrounded, not just by one person, but by multiple pressures closing in from different directions. Family conflict, financial control, a familiar face refusing distance, and now, a vehicle that appeared wherever she went. Yet, when Emily shared pieces of her fear with friends, many dismissed it as anxiety tied to sudden wealth. They told her she needed rest. They said she was adjusting to a new reality. They encouraged her to stay positive and avoid thinking the worst about people she had known for years. Worried, that dismissal left her feeling alone with thoughts she couldn't fully explain. In one of her final notes before the birthday dinner, she wrote that she planned to tell her mother everything, every fear, every threat, every strange encounter, that very night. She never got the chance, because by the time Emily walked into that dinner, someone had already decided when her life would change forever. And soon, that decision would lead directly to the quiet stretch of highway where her car would be found abandoned, and she would vanish without a trace. October 14th, 2005 began like any other Friday. Ordinary, predictable, harmless. Emily went to work. She smiled through appointments. She responded politely to conversations that drifted back to her lottery win. On the surface, nothing seemed different. But people who saw her that day later described a subtle change. Her laughter felt forced. She checked her phone more often than usual. She paused before answering questions, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. That evening, she arrived at her mother Lucille's birthday dinner, carrying more than just a gift bag and a tired smile. She carried weeks of fear she hadn't fully shared yet. Family members filled the restaurant with noise, plates clinking, voices rising, birthday candles glowing warmly in the center of the table. For most people, it felt like a celebration. For Emily, it felt like a countdown. She chose a seat facing the entrance instead of sitting beside the wall. Her purse never left her lap. Whenever the door opened, her eyes lifted instantly, scanning every person who walked inside. Her phone lit up repeatedly throughout the night. Messages arrived one after another. She glanced at the screen, swallowed hard, and turned it face down each time. Lucille noticed the tension immediately. She leaned closer and asked what was wrong. Emily hesitated. Her gaze moved across the table, at relatives laughing, at familiar faces she didn't want to worry. "I need to tell you something later," she whispered quietly, "when we're alone." Those words carried urgency, but the moment to speak never came, because outside that restaurant, unseen eyes were already tracking her movements, waiting for the moment she would step into the night alone. As the dinner wound down, conversations softened and chairs began to scrape against the floor. Family members gathered their coats, laughter lingering in the air. To everyone else, it had been a normal celebration. To Emily, it felt unfinished. She checked her phone again, another message lighting up the screen. Her expression tightened for a split second before she slipped the device back into her purse. A relative asked if she was okay. She nodded quickly, offering a smile that faded almost as soon as it appeared. When the group stepped outside, the night air felt colder than expected. Streetlights flickered across the parking lot, reflecting off parked cars and passing headlights. Emily's eyes moved from one vehicle to another, scanning longer than anyone else noticed. One cousin later remembered her pausing mid-step, staring across the street as if recognizing something, or someone, she didn't want to see. When asked what was wrong, she simply said she was tired and ready to go home. Lucille hugged her tightly near the entrance. Witnesses said the embrace lasted longer than usual. Emily held on as if she wanted to say something more, words caught somewhere between fear and hesitation. "Drive safe," her mother told her. Emily nodded, but her shoulders remained tense. She walked quickly to her car, keys already in her hand. Surveillance cameras captured her unlocking the door, glancing once over her shoulder before getting inside. The engine started. Headlights swept across the lot. As she pulled away from the restaurant, she didn't know that the next 20 minutes would change everything, not just for her, but for every person who loved her. And behind her, unseen, someone else had already begun moving. The roads were nearly empty as Emily merged onto the highway. And night traffic moved steadily but quietly, headlights stretching into long lines ahead of her. The drive home should have taken less than 20 minutes. A familiar route she had traveled countless times before. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She adjusted the radio. She checked her mirrors. Her hands remained tight on the steering wheel, tension lingering from the dinner conversation she never finished. Her phone buzzed once more in the passenger seat, lighting up the interior briefly before going dark again. A few miles into the drive, she noticed headlights behind her that didn't seem to fade with distance. They remained steady, keeping pace no matter how she changed lanes. She accelerated slightly. The lights followed. She slowed down. The gap between vehicles barely changed. Her breathing grew shallow. She glanced at her rearview mirror again and again, trying to make out details through the darkness. The vehicle stayed far enough back to remain unclear, but close enough to feel intentional. Emily exited the highway briefly, testing whether the car would continue following her. It did. Back on the main road, her movements became sharper. She checked side mirrors constantly. Her shoulders stiffened. The sense of being watched, something she had feared for weeks, now felt real. And then, something forced her off the road. Witnesses later reported seeing headlights veer suddenly toward the shoulder. One driver slowed down, thinking a car might be broken down or involved in a minor accident. But no collision sounds followed, only silence stretching into the night. Moments later, her vehicle came to a stop. And that was the last confirmed sighting of Emily Brown. Just after sunrise, a passing truck driver noticed a vehicle parked awkwardly along the shoulder of I-25. The driver's door hung open. One tire rested slightly off the gravel edge, as if the car had stopped suddenly rather than parked with care. He slowed, expecting to see someone nearby. No one was there. Inside the car, Emily's purse sat on the passenger seat. Her wallet remained untouched. Cash was still inside. Her phone rested on the floorboard, screen dark and lifeless. There were no signs of a struggle visible at first glance. No shattered glass, no skid marks stretching across the road. Yet something felt deeply wrong. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. Early assumptions pointed toward a voluntary disappearance or a sudden emotional decision to leave everything behind. Some officers suggested she may have walked away on her own, but small details refused to fit that narrative. The driver's seat had been pushed back farther than Emily normally kept it. Her birthday gift, a small clover charm necklace, was found near the edge of the pavement several feet behind the car, as though it had fallen during movement rather than while sitting inside. Witnesses from the night before began reporting a dark SUV lingering in nearby lanes. None could give a clear description, only that it stayed close to Emily's vehicle for miles. Despite these details, the case stalled almost immediately. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Public attention faded. Leads dried up. Then the highway returned to normal traffic patterns, leaving only unanswered questions behind. And somewhere beyond that quiet stretch of road, the truth remained hidden. The discovery of Emily's car was only the beginning. At first, investigators believed the case would move quickly. A young woman vanished after a birthday celebration. Her vehicle left abandoned along a major highway, witnesses recalling a dark SUV trailing her path. It seemed like a case with momentum, but within weeks, cracks began forming inside the investigation itself. Different teams started chasing different theories. One group leaned heavily toward the idea that Emily left voluntarily, pointing to her recent lottery win and the sudden pressures that followed. They argued that overwhelming attention, financial stress, unease, and strained relationships could have pushed her toward a drastic decision. Another group rejected that completely. They focused on the physical evidence, the open car door, untouched cash, the necklace found behind the vehicle. To them, nothing about the scene suggested someone who chose to disappear on her own terms. These disagreements created tension behind closed doors. Family members felt the division immediately. Emily's mother attended meeting after meeting, pleading for a unified search effort. Instead, she heard conflicting explanations and watched valuable time slip away as teams pursued opposing directions. Volunteers who had once filled search areas began receiving mixed instructions. Some were told to concentrate on nearby woods and drainage routes. Others were redirected toward financial leads and personal connections. The community started to lose confidence. Rumors spread quickly. Whispers that investigators were arguing internally, that certain suspects were being ignored while others were unfairly targeted. Local media picked up on the confusion, reporting contradictory updates that left the public uncertain about what to believe. Meanwhile, the dark SUV sightings received little coordinated follow-up. Witnesses grew frustrated as their reports seemed to vanish into silence. And for Emily's mother, the worst pain wasn't just the lack of answers. It was the growing feeling that the search for her daughter was slowly falling apart from within. While investigators debated theories, someone out there still carried the truth. With pressure mounting and public fear growing louder by the day, investigators shifted their focus toward one person, Kalen. He wasn't a stranger to Emily. He had hovered around her life for months, always nearby, always watching from the edges. Friends described him as unpredictable. Some said he admired Emily in ways that made them uncomfortable. Others admitted they simply didn't trust him. That was enough to make him the center of attention. Police called him in for questioning. Cameras lined the sidewalk outside the station, reporters waiting like predators sensing weakness. Before any charges were filed, before evidence was confirmed, Kalen's name began circulating through headlines and social media posts. Person of interest. Those 3 words were enough to turn public opinion into a storm. His face appeared on nightly news segments. Neighbors stopped answering his calls. Employers quietly cut ties. In online forums filled with accusations from people who had never met him but felt certain they knew the truth. Inside interrogation rooms, investigators pressed harder and harder. They questioned his movements, his past arguments with Emily, every message he had ever sent her. Each answer that failed to produce a confession only increased frustration, but there was a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. There was no physical evidence tying Kalen to Emily's disappearance. No DNA. No witness placing him at the highway that night. No financial link. No digital trail connecting him to the abandoned car. Still, the investigation kept circling him. Emily's mother watched in silence as the case narrowed too quickly. She feared the search was shrinking instead of expanding, that investigators were forcing a solution because they needed one, and not because it was right. Meanwhile, the real danger remained untouched, and every hour spent chasing the wrong direction gave that danger more time, more distance, and more control over Emily's fate. The moment Kalen's name leaked to the press, the story stopped being about Emily and started becoming a spectacle. News vans crowded outside his apartment. Commentators filled airwaves with bold claims disguised as analysis. Headlines screamed accusations long before facts had a chance to breathe. People who had never spoken to Emily suddenly declared themselves experts on her life. They dissected her friendships, replayed old photos, and twisted harmless interactions into dark narratives that fit a story viewers wanted to believe. The public latched onto Kalen as the villain. Online communities turned ruthless. His social media pages flooded with threats and insults. Anonymous users posted his address. Strangers followed him in parking lots, filming his every movement as if they were hunting a monster. Meanwhile, Emily's actual disappearance, her fear, her last moments, the unanswered questions surrounding the abandoned car, slowly faded into the background. The case became entertainment. Investigators felt the pressure too. Every press conference demanded answers they didn't have. Every broadcast questioned why an arrest hadn't been made. Behind closed doors, the urgency to produce a result grew heavier than the responsibility to find the truth. Emily's mother watched interviews that made her stomach turn. Reporters asked her about Kaylin more than they asked about her daughter. They wanted drama. They wanted someone to blame. They wanted closure delivered fast enough to hold viewers' attention. But Emily was still missing, and the louder the media became, the quieter the real clues seemed to grow. Witnesses who mentioned the dark SUV struggled to get callbacks. Tips about financial tensions surrounding Emily's life were buried under endless discussions about Kaylin's personality and past mistakes. The investigation had lost its balance, and somewhere far from the cameras, the person truly responsible remained invisible, protected by the chaos that everyone else had created. Months turned into years, and the investigation slowed until it barely moved at all. Kaylin remained trapped under a cloud of suspicion, even after authorities quietly admitted they had no evidence strong enough to charge him. The damage to his life had already been done, friendships lost, reputation shattered, and a permanent label he could never fully escape. But Emily was still gone. Search efforts grew smaller. Community volunteers who once covered miles of terrain began losing hope. Tip lines that once rang constantly fell silent. News coverage shifted toward newer tragedies, leaving Emily's story pushed into short segments and forgotten headlines. Emily's mother refused to let the world move on. She organized candlelight vigils where fewer and fewer people showed up each year. She handed out flyers herself, knocking on doors long after investigators stopped visiting neighborhoods. Her pain hardened into determination, the kind fueled by the belief that someone, somewhere, still knew the truth. Behind closed doors, even some investigators began questioning the early decisions made in the case. Leads that had been ignored resurfaced too late. Witness statements were reviewed again, revealing gaps that should have been examined years earlier. But time had already erased so much. Memories faded. Surveillance footage was lost. Potential witnesses moved away or stopped responding. The trail grew colder with every passing season. And the most terrifying realization slowly settled in. The real predator had never been stopped. The investigation had spent years chasing the wrong direction, while the true danger lived freely, untouched by suspicion. If this case makes your blood boil, if watching an innocent life get destroyed while the real threat walked free makes you angry, then subscribe right now so stories like Emily's never get buried in silence again. Staying informed is power, and if you choose not to subscribe, and tell us in the comments why keeping these stories visible doesn't matter to you. Every voice reveals where people stand when justice is at risk. And while the world slowly forgot, someone was preparing a truth far more terrifying than anyone expected. For years, investigators chased ghosts while the real threat lived inside Emily's circle, smiling during searches, standing beside grieving friends, and pretending to want answers just as badly as everyone else. Mike and Dave had always seemed like opposites. Mike played the part of the struggling partner, overwhelmed by debt and desperate for financial stability. Dave presented himself as calm and calculated, offering advice about managing Emily's sudden wealth. Together, they created an illusion of concern that masked something far darker, quiet resentment and growing greed. The lottery win didn't bring celebration for them. It triggered obsession. Mike's financial collapse worsened quickly after Emily's windfall. Bills piled up, lenders called constantly, and the difference between his life and Emily's new freedom became impossible for him to ignore. Dave, on the other hand, studied her finances closely, asking questions about investments, payouts, and long-term plans that felt intrusive but were brushed off as friendly interest. Behind closed doors, their conversations changed tone. Witness statements later described arguments about money that escalated beyond normal disagreements. There were rumors that Mike felt entitled to Emily's winnings because of their past relationship. Others recalled Dave making unsettling comments about how easily someone could disappear if they trusted the wrong people. No one took those remarks seriously at the time. On the night of the birthday dinner, subtle signals went unnoticed. Exchanged glances, tense silences, forced laughter during conversations about Emily's future. She sensed something was wrong. Friends remembered her checking her phone repeatedly. scanning the room like she wanted to leave but didn't want to cause a scene. After the dinner ended, Mike and Dave didn't go home immediately. Phone records later revealed coordinated movements. Gas station footage captured a vehicle similar to Dave's parked miles away from where he claimed to be. Mike's phone went dark for several hours, the same hours Emily vanished, and yet, during the early years of the investigation, both men blended perfectly into the background. They attended vigils. They comforted Emily's mother. They spoke to reporters with convincing sadness. The truth was standing in front of everyone the entire time. Two men bound by resentment, united by opportunity, waiting for the perfect moment to take control of Emily's life and her fortune. What investigators would later uncover wasn't a random crime. It was betrayal born from trust, and it had already moved far beyond a simple disappearance. Emily never made it home that night. Instead, investigators would later learn she was driven hours away from the city, past familiar roads, past streetlights, into isolated terrain where help rarely came and witnesses were almost non-existent. Snow covered the narrow dirt paths leading toward an aging hunting cabin owned through a distant connection to Dave's extended family, a property rarely visited, nearly invisible on standard maps, and far enough from neighbors to silence any screams. Inside that cabin, her world changed instantly. The windows were boarded from the outside. Heavy locks reinforced the doors. A single mattress lay on the wooden floor beside a small heater that barely warmed the room. A chair was bolted to the wall. Empty food cans filled a corner like quiet proof this space had been prepared long before Emily ever arrived. This was not an impulsive act. It was calculated confinement. Mike played the emotional role at first, telling her everything would be temporary, that she just needed to cooperate, that he was protecting her from threats she didn't understand. Dave remained colder, more distant, monitoring every movement with rigid control. Together they created a psychological cage just as strong as the physical one. They controlled time by turning off lights unpredictably. They controlled reality by lying about the outside world. They controlled hope by offering small privileges, food, blankets, conversation. Only when she complied. Days blurred into weeks. Emily tried to mark time by scratching faint lines into the wall behind the mattress. She whispered reminders of her own name so she wouldn't lose herself completely. She replayed memories of her mother, her friends, and her old life, clinging to anything that proved she still existed beyond that room. At first she resisted openly, shouting, refusing food, demanding release. The response was silence, long hours without human contact, cold nights without blankets, constant reminders that no one was coming to save her. Slowly, exhaustion replaced defiance. What Mike and Dave wanted wasn't immediate violence. They wanted submission, emotional dependence that would make Emily easier to control and less likely to fight back. Each conversation blurred truth and lies until her sense of reality began to fracture. Outside, search parties scoured highways and forests, believing Emily was lost or worse. Inside that cabin, she was alive, but every passing day chipped away at the person she used to be. The physical restraints were only part of the prison. Mike and Dave understood that the fastest way to control Emily was to fracture her sense of reality. Violence alone would create resistance. Confusion would create dependence. So, they turned to mental warfare, quiet, persistent, and deeply cruel. One morning, Dave placed a stack of printed news articles in front of her. My headlines claimed the search had ended. Some said authorities believed she left voluntarily. Others suggested she had taken the lottery money and vanished to escape debt or personal problems. Every article was fake. Dates didn't match real calendars. Photos were poorly edited. Quotes from official sources were fabricated. But after weeks without outside contact, Emily struggled to separate truth from deception. The men told her the world had moved on, that even her mother had stopped looking, convinced Emily had chosen a new life without anyone. Mike alternated between comfort and intimidation. Some days he apologized, speaking softly, telling her he never wanted things to go this far. Other days he snapped, reminding her she had no power, no voice, and no one coming to rescue her. Then that emotional whiplash left her constantly unsure which version of him she would face next, the remorseful partner or the cold stranger. Sleep deprivation became another weapon. Lights flicked on in the middle of the night, Loud noises echoed through the cabin without warning. Conversations happened outside her door just loud enough for her to hear fragments, references to money transfers, threats, and discussions about what happens if she stops cooperating. They forced her to write letters claiming she was safe and traveling by choice. Letters never sent, but used to reinforce the illusion that she had already disappeared willingly. Over time, doubt crept into her thoughts. She began questioning her own memory of events, replaying the night of the dinner, and wondering if she had somehow caused this nightmare. And still, small sparks of resistance remained. She memorized patterns in their behavior. She noticed when Dave left supplies near the door. She counted steps from the mattress to the entrance, mapping the room in her mind. Because deep down, even when exhaustion tried to erase hope, Emily refused to believe this was the end of her story. Winter arrived harder than anyone expected. Snow buried the mountain roads surrounding the cabin, cutting off easy access to nearby towns. Supplies ran low faster than Mike and Dave anticipated, forcing them to make longer trips away from the property, sometimes leaving Emily alone for short stretches while they searched for fuel and food. One night, a brutal storm tore through the region. Wind slammed against the cabin walls. Snow drifted through cracks in the boards covering the windows. The heater struggled to stay alive, filling the room with cold air that cut straight through Emily's bones. For hours she sat on the mattress, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the storm roar louder than any sound she had heard in years. And for the first time, she noticed something different. Dave had rushed out earlier than usual to secure supplies before roads closed completely. Mike followed soon after, worried about getting trapped without enough food. In their haste, one lock on the interior door wasn't secured fully. The metal latch hung slightly open, barely noticeable unless someone was searching carefully. Emily didn't move at first. Fear froze her in place. She had been conditioned to expect punishment for even small acts of defiance, but as the hours passed and no one returned, a quiet determination replaced hesitation. Her hands shook as she tested the door. It resisted, then gave way with a dull click. Cold air rushed into the room. She stepped into a narrow hallway she had never seen clearly before, cluttered with equipment, old coats, and stacked boxes. Every sound felt amplified by the storm outside. She grabbed the first heavy jacket she could find, wrapped it tightly around herself, and pushed toward the main entrance. The outside world hit her like a wall of ice. Snow reached past her knees. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. She stumbled forward blindly, guided by nothing but instinct and the distant memory of how the road curved when she first arrived. Each step felt heavier than the last, her body weakened by years of confinement and poor nutrition. But stopping meant death. Hours later, after collapsing more than once, she reached a narrow highway just as a snowplow driver passed through the storm. The operator nearly missed her, a shadow against endless white, until she waved with the last strength she had left. When authorities arrived, Emily could barely speak. She gave only fragments of information, names whispered through cracked lips, enough to shatter the case wide open and expose the betrayal that had remained hidden for nearly a decade. The disappearance was never a mystery. It was a carefully maintained prison, and Emily had just broken free. When Emily reached safety after the blizzard, freedom didn't feel like victory. Her body was rescued, but her identity felt shattered. For weeks she struggled to answer even basic questions. Police officers spoke gently. A spa therapist tried to ground her in reality, but the outside world felt distant, almost unreal. Years of isolation had changed how she processed time, trust, and even simple conversation. Instead of returning immediately to public life, Emily chose distance. She moved under a temporary identity in a quiet rural community far from the headlines. The new name protected her from reporters, strangers, and the constant reminders of everything she had lost. She worked small jobs that required little interaction, washing dishes in a diner, stocking shelves at a grocery store, anything that allowed her to exist without being recognized. Nightmares followed her everywhere. She woke up terrified by ordinary sounds, doors closing, footsteps in hallways, even laughter from nearby tables. Crowded spaces triggered panic attacks that left her breathless and shaking. Some days, she barely left her room, staring at old photographs she carried with her, proof that another version of herself had once lived a different life. News reports occasionally mentioned her case, but she avoided watching them. The world had moved on, and she wasn't sure she knew how to return. She wasn't hiding because she didn't care about justice. She was surviving, one fragile day at a time, trying to rebuild a sense of self that had been stolen piece by piece. While Emily tried to rebuild a life far from the spotlight, her mother, Lucille, remained frozen in the moment her daughter vanished. Emily's bedroom stayed exactly as it had been in 2005. Clothes hung untouched in the closet. Birthday cards sat on the dresser. A half-finished novel remained open on the nightstand, a bookmark holding a place that never moved. Dust gathered slowly over the years, but Lucille refused to rearrange anything. To her, changing the room felt like surrendering hope. Every morning began with the same routine. Coffee brewed while Lucille checked old voicemail recordings just to hear Emily's voice again. She kept a calendar filled with dates connected to the case, search anniversaries, news segments, and every phone call from investigators. When public interest faded, she organized small local vigils herself, standing in cold weather with a photograph clutched tightly against her chest. Friends and neighbors tried to convince her to move on. Some said acceptance would bring peace. Others believed continuing the search was only prolonging pain. Lucille listened politely, then returned to printing missing person flyers and contacting reporters who barely remembered the story anymore. She refused to let Emily become a forgotten headline. Even when years passed without answers, Lucille spoke about her daughter in the present tense. Never was, always is. She believed Emily was alive somewhere, waiting for someone to keep searching when everyone else had stopped. That belief became her strength, and the quiet force that kept the case breathing long after the world lost interest. Years passed, and the noise around Emily's disappearance faded. At first, news stations covered every development. Interviews with neighbors, candlelight vigils, emotional appeals from family members. Her photograph appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages across the country. But as time moved forward and new cases captured public attention, Emily's story slowly disappeared from headlines. True crime forums stopped discussing her case. Reporters stopped calling Lucille for updates. Search volunteers stopped showing up. The silence grew heavier than the early chaos. In the small town where Emily lived under a different identity, no one knew her history. Customers at the diner saw only a quiet woman who avoided eye contact. Co-workers noticed her flinching at sudden noises, but never understood why. She watched people laugh and share stories about their families, while she carried memories she couldn't safely reveal. Loneliness wrapped around her like an invisible wall. She wanted to call her mother more than anything, to hear her voice, to say she was alive. But fear held her back, a fear that her captors still had power, fear that stepping into the public eye again would reopen wounds she barely survived. Meanwhile, the world labeled her case cold. To strangers, she became a statistic buried under newer tragedies. Online discussions turned into short threads filled with speculation and fading interest. The longer the silence lasted, the easier it became for people to assume she would never return. But somewhere, Lucille still waited. And somewhere, Emily still carried the weight of a story that wasn't finished yet. 9 years is a long time for memories to fade. Witnesses moved away. Old friends stopped answering calls from journalists. Investigative files gathered dust in storage rooms, reopened only when new detectives rotated onto cold case units searching for anything that had been missed. Old leads that once felt urgent turned into outdated notes buried deep inside case folders. The city changed. New buildings replaced old businesses Emily used to visit. Restaurants closed, neighborhoods evolved. To many people, her disappearance became something they vaguely remembered hearing about years ago, a story with no ending, quietly slipping from public consciousness. Lucille felt that shift more than anyone. Phone calls from investigators grew less frequent. Annual updates became shorter and more formal. Even well-meaning neighbors stopped asking how she was doing because they assumed nothing new would ever happen. Some suggested selling the house, packing away Emily's belongings, and allowing herself to move forward. But Lucille refused. Every so often she reopened old boxes filled with case documents, newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes from detectives. She reread witness statements and highlighted small details others ignored. She believed answers still existed, hidden somewhere inside the past. One stormy evening, while searching for supplies to repair minor damage to her attic after heavy rain, Lucille noticed something she had never seen before: a loose board tucked behind old insulation. It looked insignificant, but that small discovery would become the moment that shattered nearly a decade of silence and changed the course of the entire investigation forever. The storm arrived without warning. Heavy rain slammed against Lucille's roof for hours, shaking windows and flooding gutters that hadn't been tested by weather that strong in years. Water began dripping through the ceiling into a small corner of the hallway. Slow at first, nay then steady enough to force her into action. She grabbed a ladder and climbed into the attic with a flashlight, expecting nothing more than a simple leak. Dust coated everything. Old storage boxes filled with holiday decorations and family keepsakes sat untouched for nearly a decade. The air smelled stale, thick with memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. As she moved insulation aside, searching for the source of the water, her flashlight beam caught something unusual. A narrow wooden panel slightly raised from the rest of the floor. Lucille paused. The board didn't match the others. Its edges were cleaner, newer. Curious, she pushed against it gently. The panel shifted, revealing a shallow compartment hidden beneath layers of insulation. Inside sat a small metal container, scratched, weathered, all and sealed tightly as if someone wanted it forgotten forever. Her hands trembled as she opened it. At first she saw only loose photographs bound together with a rubber band. Then a disposable camera wrapped in plastic. Beneath those, a thin notebook filled with handwriting she recognized instantly. Emily's. The air left Lucille's lungs. For years she had searched for even the smallest clue, and now something deeply personal lay in her hands, hidden in her own home the entire time. Rain pounded harder against the roof as she flipped through the first pages. Fragmented notes, dates circled repeatedly, scribbled thoughts about fear and suspicion during the weeks before Emily disappeared. This wasn't a random discovery. It was a message waiting to be found. And every second Lucille stood in that attic, she felt the case shifting, the silence finally cracking open to reveal truths no one had seen before. Lucille carried the metal container downstairs, like it might disappear if she blinked. Her hands shook as she placed everything across the kitchen table: photographs, the thin notebook, and the disposable camera sealed carefully in plastic. The camera felt heavier than it should have, loaded with moments no one had ever seen. She hesitated for only a second before calling a trusted family friend who worked in photo processing. Within hours, the film was developed. What emerged from those images changed everything. The first photos looked ordinary, snapshots from Emily's daily life during the weeks before she vanished. Friends gathered at coffee shops, street scenes, quick pictures taken through car windows as if Emily had been documenting her routine. But as the sequence progressed, the tone shifted. Several photos captured a dark SUV parked near Emily's apartment, again near her workplace, again outside a grocery store miles away. The same vehicle appeared repeatedly from different angles, always at a distance yet clearly following a pattern. Lucille's heart pounded as she continued sorting through the stack. One image showed Mike standing near the SUV, unaware he was being photographed. Another captured Dave speaking with him outside a gas station late at night, a moment neither man had ever mentioned to investigators. The timestamps aligned closely with dates Emily's journal entries described feeling watched or followed. Then came the final photograph. It showed the inside of a restaurant, Emily's birthday dinner, taken from across the room. Mike and Dave sat side by side, leaning toward each other in an intense conversation, while Emily looked tense, distracted, and isolated from the rest of the table. Written in faint ink on the back was a single line: "They don't know I see what they're doing." The room fell silent as Lucille processed what she was holding. For years, investigators assumed Emily had been caught off guard, but these images suggested something far more disturbing. She knew she was in danger, and she had been quietly gathering proof long before anyone realized the threat was real. The photographs were only the beginning. Lucille turned her attention to the thin notebook, its cover worn, edges frayed from use. Every page carried Emily's handwriting, sometimes neat and controlled, sometimes rushed and uneven like thoughts written during moments of fear. Dates filled the margins, many from the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The first entries described small details most people would ignore: strangers lingering near her car, phone calls that disconnected the moment she answered, footsteps behind her when she walked alone at night. At first, Emily questioned her own instincts, wondering if sudden wealth had made her paranoid. But as the entries continued, her tone shifted from uncertainty to alarm. She began tracking license plate numbers, noting locations where she saw the same dark SUV, recording conversations that left her unsettled. Several pages mentioned Mike asking increasingly invasive questions about her finances, details she never shared publicly. Others described Dave offering to help manage things, while pushing her to sign documents she didn't fully understand. One entry stopped Lucille cold. Emily wrote about overhearing a heated argument between the two men outside a restaurant. She described them discussing money as if it already belonged to them, arguing over percentages, deadlines, and how long they should wait before making a move. Emily admitted she felt trapped between fear and disbelief, unsure whether to confront them or quietly gather more proof. The final pages grew more frantic. Handwriting slanted sharply across the paper. Sentences broke apart mid-thought. And Emily wrote that she planned to record everything during her upcoming birthday dinner: conversations, behavior, anything that could confirm her suspicions. And near the back, one short line stood alone. "They said tonight changes everything. If something happens to me, look at them first." Lucille pressed the notebook against her chest as tears fell freely. For nearly a decade, the answers had existed in her own home, waiting silently, holding the voice of a daughter who knew danger was coming and tried desperately to leave behind the truth. Lucille didn't sleep that night. She reread every page again and again, cross-checking dates with old calendars and news clippings she had saved for years. The more she compared Emily's notes to the official investigation timeline, the clearer it became that critical warnings had been overlooked from the very beginning. Early the next morning, she walked into the police station, carrying the notebook, photographs, and camera prints sealed carefully in a plastic folder. Detectives reviewed the material in stunned silence. The repeated SUV sightings, the images linking Mike and Dave, the detailed descriptions of conversations about money. Every piece contradicted the narrative investigators had followed for nearly a decade. Then they reached the final page. Emily had written about the birthday dinner, the moment she believed everything would be revealed. She described overhearing a quiet confession from one of the men during a private conversation near the restaurant exit. According to her notes, he admitted that her sudden wealth had created an opportunity that wouldn't come twice. She wrote that she felt watched constantly, that she was planning to confront them soon, but feared she might not get the chance. One sentence, underlined 3 times, changed everything. "If anything happens after tonight, they planned it together." Detectives exchanged glances. Years of dead ends collapsed under the weight of those words. Search strategies shifted immediately. Warrants were prepared. Old alibis were reopened with new urgency. The case that once felt frozen suddenly surged forward with undeniable direction. And for viewers watching this story unfold, this is the moment that proves why staying informed matters, because danger often comes from the people we trust most. May stories like this expose threats hiding in plain sight. Subscribe now so you never miss warnings that could protect someone you love. If you're choosing not to subscribe, tell us why in the comments. We want to hear your reason. Lucille left the station that day carrying something she hadn't felt in years: hope, backed by evidence strong enough to force the truth into the light. The evidence Lucille uncovered ignited the case overnight. News outlets that had ignored Emily's disappearance for years suddenly competed for interviews. Reporters flooded Lucille's phone with requests, promising national coverage and renewed attention. After nearly a decade of silence, the story was alive again. At first, she hesitated. Public attention meant reopening pain she had carried quietly for years. Yet it meant reliving every unanswered question and facing a world that once moved on without her daughter. But detectives encouraged her to speak, believing the evidence could trigger new witnesses or force hidden truths into the open. So, Lucille agreed to a televised interview. The studio lights felt overwhelming as she sat across from the host, hands folded tightly around Emily's photograph. When the camera began recording, her voice trembled, but she refused to look away. She described the attic discovery, the photographs, the journal entries, and the chilling sentence that pointed directly toward betrayal. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from years of anger, exhaustion, and fierce love. She spoke about sleepless nights, unanswered calls, and the quiet pain of watching the world forget a daughter who still deserved justice. As the segment aired nationwide, viewers responded instantly. Social media erupted with renewed interest. Former neighbors shared memories. People who once ignored the case began asking questions again. Tips started flooding into police departments, some small, others deeply significant. For the first time in years, Emily's name returned to the national conversation, and somewhere far away, someone watching that broadcast felt their carefully built silence begin to crack. The interview didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Clips spread across news platforms, true crime forums, and social media pages within hours. Viewers watched Lucille hold up Emily's photograph, her voice shaking as she spoke directly to anyone who might know something. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for courage, for someone to come forward and break the silence that had protected the truth for too long. Her message was simple and raw. Someone out there knows what happened. Someone has been afraid to speak. Please, don't stay silent anymore. People listened. Former co-workers reached out with details they once considered unimportant. A waitress who remembered Mike and Dave arguing during the birthday dinner contacted authorities after recognizing their names again. A retired mechanic called police to report a dark SUV he repaired years earlier, one that matched the description in Emily's photographs. Online communities rallied together. Volunteers shared timelines, analyzed photos, and tracked inconsistencies in old statements. Viewers debated motives, questioned alibis, and pushed media outlets to keep the story alive instead of letting it fade again. The renewed attention placed pressure on everyone connected to the case, especially those who had relied on time and silence to protect them. For Lucille, the flood of support felt overwhelming. Letters arrived from strangers promising they wouldn't forget Emily again. People sent messages describing how her strength inspired them to confront their own fears and speak up about dangerous situations in their lives. And somewhere, far from the cameras, a woman sitting alone in a small diner watched the broadcast replay on a mounted television, her hands trembling, her breathing shallow, as memories she tried to bury for years rushed back all at once. The diner was quiet that afternoon. A television mounted above the counter played a loop of national news segments while customers ate in silence. Emily moved slowly between tables, carrying coffee cups and avoiding eye contact the way she always did. She had learned to exist unnoticed, to blend into routines that asked no questions. Then she heard her name. At first she froze mid-step, hoping she misheard it. But when she turned toward the screen, she saw her mother's face filling the frame. Older, tired, but unmistakably determined. Lucille held up the attic photographs, the journal, and spoke words Emily never expected to hear again. They said tonight changes everything, and my daughter knew she was in danger. Emily's hands began to shake. The broadcast showed the same birthday dinner photo she had taken years earlier. An analyst discussed the dark SUV, Mike, Dave, details she thought had been buried forever. Customers in the diner leaned closer to the television, whispering to each other about the shocking developments, unaware that the quiet woman refilling their water glasses was the missing person everyone was discussing. Panic hit first. Her breathing became shallow. The clatter of dishes sounded distant. Memories flooded back. The cabin, the cold nights, the escape through blinding snow. She retreated to the kitchen and leaned against a wall, struggling to steady herself, as reporters repeated her story across every channel. But beneath the fear, something else rose. Relief. The truth was finally being spoken out loud. Her mother had never stopped searching. The evidence she left behind had been found. For the first time since her rescue, Emily realized she didn't have to stay invisible forever. She could return, and the decision forming in that quiet diner would change everything. Emily left work early that day. Her manager noticed her pale expression but didn't ask questions. She walked home through cold evening air, every step heavier than the last. The broadcast replayed constantly in her mind, her mother's voice, the photographs, the words she had written years earlier, finally reaching the world. For hours she sat alone in her small apartment. Old memories clashed with present reality. Fear told her to stay hidden. Trauma reminded her how dangerous exposure could be. But another voice, quieter, stronger, reminded her that the truth was finally visible. The evidence Lucille discovered had reopened the investigation. Its detectives were searching again, and for the first time, Emily wasn't alone in carrying the burden of what happened. She picked up her phone, then set it down. She paced the room, sat, stood again. Tears came without warning as she replayed her mother's plea asking someone, anyone, to speak up. That message wasn't meant for strangers only. It was meant for her, too. Late that night, Emily packed a small bag. Inside, she placed the photographs she had carried for years, the few belongings tied to her real identity, and a folded newspaper clipping showing her own missing person notice. She stared at the image for a long time before slipping it into the bag and zipping it closed. The next morning, she stepped onto a bus heading toward the nearest city with a major police station. Every mile forward felt like walking back into the storm she once escaped. But this time, she wasn't running from the past. She was returning to face it, ready to tell the truth, ready to confront the people who stole years of her life, and ready to bring the story toward an ending no one thought they would ever witness. The police station looked ordinary from the outside. People walked in and out carrying paperwork. Officers chatted near the entrance, and patrol cars rolled slowly through the parking lot. No one paid attention to the quiet woman standing across the street, her hands gripping the strap of a worn bag, her breathing unsteady as years of fear pressed against her chest. Emily stood there for several minutes. She watched the glass doors open and close, and each movement reminding her how close she was to stepping back into a world that once searched desperately for her, then slowly forgot her name. Her reflection in the window looked different from the person who vanished. Older, thinner, carrying invisible scars no one else could see. Finally. She crossed the street. The sound of the doors sliding open echoed louder than anything she remembered. A receptionist looked up with a polite smile and asked how she could help. Emily tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She swallowed hard, forced the words out slowly. "My name is Emily Carter. I think you've been looking for me." The room fell silent. Officers exchanged stunned glances. One detective rushed forward, carefully guiding her to a chair, as disbelief spread across every face. Some had grown up hearing about the case, and others recognized her instantly from recent news coverage. Within minutes, supervisors were called, cameras were turned off to protect her privacy, and the station shifted into quiet urgency. Emily handed over the bag she carried, photographs, identification, fragments of her past, carefully preserved through years of hiding. Tears streamed down her face as she began recounting pieces of her story, the cabin, the escape, the long silence that followed. For the first time in nearly a decade, she wasn't invisible. She was home, and the truth was finally ready to be heard. Detectives worked quickly but gently. While Emily provided her first statements, another officer placed a call Lucille had waited nearly a decade to receive. The voice on the other end was careful, measured, asking her to come to the station immediately. They refused to explain why, only repeating that she needed to arrive as soon as possible. The drive felt endless. Lucille's hands shook on the steering wheel. Her mind raced through possibilities, fear, hope, disbelief colliding all at once. When she reached the station parking lot, officers met her outside and guided her through a quiet hallway away from cameras and reporters. She opened the door and froze. Emily stood on the other side of the room. For a moment, neither moved. Years of pain, unanswered questions, and silent prayers filled the space between them. Lucille's hand rose slowly to her mouth as tears blurred her vision. Emily whispered a single word, "Mom," her voice breaking under the weight of everything she had carried alone. Then they ran to each other. The embrace was tight, desperate, and wordless. Lucille held her daughter's face in both hands, studying every detail like she needed proof this wasn't another dream. Emily buried her head against her mother's shoulder, shaking with sobs that had waited years to be released. There were no perfect words, only apologies for lost time, gratitude for survival, and quiet promises never to let each other disappear again. Detectives stepped back respectfully, allowing the reunion to unfold without interruption. Outside the room, officers exchanged emotional glances. Inside, two lives that had been separated by violence and silence finally collided again, not as headlines or missing person posters, but as mother and daughter, together, alive, and ready to face what came next. Emily's testimony changed everything within hours. Now, detectives reopened old evidence with renewed urgency. Phone records, financial transactions, travel logs, and witness statements that once seemed insignificant. With Emily's detailed account and the attic discoveries, prosecutors secured search warrants for properties connected to Mike and Dave, including the remote cabin she described in vivid detail. What investigators found confirmed years of hidden crimes. The cabin still held traces of confinement, reinforced locks, restraints, and personal items matching Emily's descriptions. Digital devices contained deleted messages discussing financial plans tied to her lottery winnings. Bank records revealed unusual transfers that began shortly after her disappearance. Every discovery reinforced the same horrifying truth. The crime had been deliberate, prolonged, and driven by greed. The police moved quickly. Mike was arrested at his workplace, stunned as officers placed him in handcuffs in front of co-workers who once believed he was a grieving partner. Dave attempted to maintain composure during questioning, but his calm exterior cracked when confronted with the photographs, journal entries, and Emily's first-hand testimony. News of the arrest spread across the country within hours. Communities that had once debated theories watched as the real suspects were finally named. Reporters gathered outside courthouses, broadcasting live updates while former friends struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the crimes now exposed. For Emily, seeing their mugshots on television triggered a storm of emotions. Anger for stolen years, relief that the truth could no longer be denied. Diane fear of reliving trauma during the upcoming trial, but this time, she wasn't alone. Her voice carried weight, her evidence carried proof, and the men who built their lives on deception were finally forced to answer for what they had done. The courtroom stayed silent as Emily took the stand. Every step toward the witness chair carried the weight of lost years. Reporters filled the back rows. Family members sat with hands clasped tightly together. Mike and Dave watched from the defense table, their confidence gone, replaced by tension that showed in every movement. Emily spoke slowly, clearly. She described the birthday dinner, the drive that never reached home, the cold walls of the cabin, and the long fight to survive. She spoke about fear, isolation, and the moment she realized she had to escape or lose herself forever. There were pauses when emotions threatened to take over, but each time she steadied her voice and continued, determined to reclaim her story from the men who tried to erase it. Prosecutors presented the photographs, the journal, the hidden evidence from the attic. Experts confirmed the timeline matched her testimony perfectly. Witnesses described suspicious behavior years earlier that suddenly made sense. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge details, but the truth stood firm under scrutiny. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned, guilty on all major charges. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as sentencing followed. Decades behind bars, without the possibility of early release. Mike lowered his head. Dave stared forward without expression. For the first time since her disappearance, Emily felt a chapter closing. Outside the courthouse, she stood beside Lucille facing cameras, not as a victim, but as a survivor. She spoke about resilience, about trusting instincts, about how silence allows harm to continue. Her final message was simple. Listen to the people you love. Pay attention when something feels wrong, and never stop searching for the truth. As the crowd dispersed, mother and daughter walked away together, no longer defined by a missing person case, but by survival, justice, and the long road toward healing that still lay ahead. The case of Emily Brown is a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives aren't the strangers in the shadows, but the ones sitting across from us at the dinner table. Emily lost 9 years of her life to a lie fueled by greed and a lottery ticket that was supposed to be a blessing. But it makes you wonder, How many other secrets are currently sitting in attics, waiting to be found? If you found Emily's story as chilling as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Archives. We dig through the files the world forgot to bring you the truth behind the headlines. For more deep dives into the dark side of human nature, click the video on your screen now. What do you think of Mike and Dave's betrayal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.